Say this about you, Larry. You're the first man that ever on the video me.
Well, I mean, you're an interesting, you're modest about it, but you've accomplished a lot in your life, and I just, like I said, I saw you sitting at Rowena one time, and I thought, boy, I'd sure like to pick his brain and talk to him but I figured you was just a busy man, and
No,
I never did.
I'm not that busy.
Yeah, let's just start. I made a few notes. So basically, I want to tell people that today's October of 2020, and I'm sitting here with Tony Sloan, and my name's Larry Melcher. I make videos as a hobby, and I called Tony on the phone, and we got to talking, and one thing led to another, and he agreed to share this with more than just me. But so Tony, I want people to understand who I'm talking to. You're a man that your family has lived here all your life in the Albany area. And you told me that your grandpa was a country doctor.
That's correct.
And your father was what'd you call it, not a vendor?
This didn't occur on Lake Cumberland now.
This was Dale Hollow he was telling me about.
Let me just start from the start, and my name is Tony Sloan. I was born in 1937, which was in the Depression, which obviously I can't remember, but I feel like I lived through it because I've heard my mother and father, my aunts and uncles, and other people talk about the Depression. So I think I have a good feel for the Depression. And this story, to understand it, you have to understand the era of time from coming out of the Depression, going through World War II. Depression, nobody had any money to spend. And when the war started, everybody that wanted a job had it and were making what they thought was good money at that time. And they had no place to spend it. Cars weren't manufactured, tires weren't available, and just limited amount of gas. And the government didn't want people traveling because it took resources away from the war effort. So I grew up in Albany, and Del Hollow Lake was finished in 1943, and nobody discovered it until after the war was over with. In that 2-year time frame between when the war ended and when the lake was impounded in 43, the fish had an opportunity to grow. And you must understand, in 1945, there was only 2 lakes in the state of Kentucky. 3 counting Kentucky Lake. It got started in 44. So lakes was a new thing for most Kentuckians and people from Ohio, like Cincinnati and Indianapolis. But they poured into Albany to fish the Lake, Del Hollow Lake. And then when Lake Cumberland came alive, and by being finished in 1950, they finished the dam and started filling it in September of 50, and it filled in the spring of 51. But the fish hadn't grown up yet, but people still, fishing was so good, you might not catch one large enough to keep it because there's a size limit of 12 inches on a bass, but it was almost the truth. You had to hide behind a tree to keep catching the fish.
That many fish.
In 1950, the Corps granted 5 marinas on Lake Cumberland. They done it by competitive bidding. Their policy was, if you could prove that you had the resources or could borrow the money enough to do what the minimum requirements at each one of these sites was, you could bid on it, and you bid a percent of your gross take. In this case, in September of 1950, the Corps opened up the bids at each of these sites, and my father acquired Grider Hill by bidding 10.75% of the gross. Now, the reason the government wanted this money was the lands that the lake covered and the government owned took away from the tax base of each county, and in lieu of that tax base, the Corps would take the 10.5% of the gross receipts of each concession and return it to that county in lieu of the tax base that was lost. This was for administrative and auditing purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad won that bid for Grider Hill. I had 3 older brothers, but they were, when this was all taking place, the first 2 or 3 years, they were all in the Korean War. Ned was next to me in age, and he was in the Air Force in Texas. Brucey was older, a little older than Ned, and he was in Korea. My oldest brother, John, was in Germany in the Army. So I grew up in the business, and they didn't. But they came along a little later on and were all involved. Not John, he was a lawyer, but Ned and Brucey stuck with me, and we all 3 were in it from the 50s, early 50s on. And he met.
And then at what point did your dad turn it over to the boys?
Well, he died in 63.
Okay, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
So he died as a young man.
Well, he's just 57.
Yeah.
My dad done a lot in my life. I ought to be bragging on him because he was into everything. Living wasn't easy made.
Yeah. So tell me about Brucey. You said Brucey worked some, and he was a night watchman down at the.
Brucey was a night owl. He's one of these people that rather stay up all night than sleep all day.
Yeah.
And he just fit that role.
So back in the early days of the lake, you said that y'all rented plywood boats.
Well, anyone that, and this is 2020, it's hard to believe what the business was in 1951. He got the lease in September of 1950 and immediately started building a little floating dock, which was probably about 25 by 40, and with walkways around it. The building wasn't quite that big, and he started building the restaurant. The spring of 51, we had about 75 wooden boats, 14-foot long plywood, flat bottom wooden boats. At that time, that cost about $100 a boat, and we rented them every weekend, April through May, and then a few maybe in June, but fishing just dies in the summer months, and then pick back up again in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
But
now you said back in those days, the fishermen didn't want aluminum boats because they made too much noise.
Yeah, fishermen at that time didn't trust aluminum boats because they made noise and they weren't stable either. They didn't trust electric motors because they created vibration, and hardly anyone had a motor any bigger than a 5 horsepower.
So you were telling me about, I think it was the following year that you doubled the size of the dock, and tell us about the lockers, the fishing lockers.
Okay. By 1952, my dad built another building a floating building and he had started on the lodge building, even in 51, but it wasn't finished until 53. But in 52, we added a large section which was nothing but lockers. And people that were regular customers, especially from Ohio or Indiana or Louisville or wherever, Lexington, would rent lockers to store all their fishing gear and their engine, which again, most of them wasn't any bigger than a 5, but occasionally they were, as years went on, they kept getting a little bigger. But in 1951, it's a rare thing to see anything bigger than a 10 horsepower motor. And most people didn't have that. And a lot of people that fished, especially locally, would rent rowboats, which was the same boat, but it had oars. And a good fishing team was 3 men, one in the middle, one in the front, one in the back. And they'd be casting, and the third one would be rowing the boat along the shoreline. And as he wore out, they'd switch positions.
That's good.
And the next guy would row. But I've seen in a half an hour's time go from Brown Creek all the way to Whippoorwill. That's how fast they moved. Well, that's true.
That's amazing. I like to hear that. So the fishing lockers, you said that
See, I could stand on the dock and see from Brown Creek to Whippoorwill.
Okay.
And I'd see that boat go right by.
Was there many times that you got to go out there? I mean, you were on the business side of it.
I was on the business side.
Did you have your share of fishing on weekends? Or
no, I never had the energy or the patience.
By the time weekend came or your day off, you were resting.
Yeah. Of course, I only worked in the summer months and on weekends, but that's the only time there's any business there anyway. There wasn't much through the middle of the week.
Yeah.
It was Saturday and Sunday and the summer months. Later on, in the early 50s, there wasn't any speedboats. Nobody had any engines of any consequence.
Well, that's interesting that you told me that in the summer it was pretty much hardly any business because the fishing was down. Back then.
You made your living in the spring and the fall, and
the recreation.
You survived through the summer, and there wasn't nothing in the winter.
So
it never will be.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah, it's already starting to clear out. Here it is, late October. There's fewer and fewer people down there.
Well, again, in 1951, our dock didn't have gas pumps on it. It had a farm tank located above the high water mark, and one of my jobs was carrying 5-gallon buckets of gas down to the dock, which you usually took 2 5-gallon cans because it's easier to carry 2 than 1.
So you're talking
you
were a 13 or 14-year-old child.
When I'm 14 years old. And likewise with the ice house. The ice house was way up the hill, had to be above the high water mark, and you carried. If you're stout enough, you could carry 2 50-gallon blocks of ice with ice thongs, but I usually got a 25 and a 25 on each side. And we stored the ice in a deep freeze down there, and then we'd sell it by blocks.
So it came in 50-pound blocks?
Well, no, the blocks would be as big as that sofa over there. And they'd back the truck up to the platform, and you just scoot them. It scoots easy. You'd be surprised. One man with ice tongs will scoot 400 or 500 pounds of ice.
A 400 or 500 pound chunk of ice, and then you chop it up from there.
It's got these seams in it. You take a ice pick and chip and it just breaks off perfect.
Uh-huh. Huh. So Tony, tell me about Rowena. So everybody's familiar with Rowena and the story that there was a ferry that crossed the lake there. So can you remember back the first time that area caught your eye and you thought, you know, that'd be a good place and maybe one day I'll...
Well, I knew the Rowena roads ended. The Rowena was the Highway Kentucky 35, which was a predecessor to US 127, was the main north road leading out of Albany. It was really the main road leading north. And it crossed the Cumberland River at a community known as Rowena. And Rowena was a community that existed because in the early days it was a trail that led to a crossing of the river on both sides. There's a trail on both sides. And because there was a trail there, then a community came into being. And then because the community was there, it became a famous steamboat landing. And it prospered from those things. They had a school and churches and stores. It wasn't near as big as Creelsboro, which is downstream about 8 or 9 miles. No, 12 miles, I guess. Creelsboro would have been downstream 12 miles. And it was a real famous steamboat landing because it was a bigger community. It had a bank and church, schools, and.
Did they land anywhere near that arch, the Creelsboro Arch? Was that anywhere close to the?
Well, the Creelsboro's Arch is probably another mile or two downstream.
Okay.
But anyway, yes, I did recognize that part of Lake Cumberland, the biggest water on Lake Cumberland, was void of service. And it was even in the master plan that Rowena was a strategic site on the lake. But Rowena, the site that the Corps chose for Rowena in the master plan, was on the south side of the lake, which was in Russell County. Therefore, Russell County didn't want it as a site originally because it wouldn't provide any employment in Russell County because nobody in Russell County lives on the south side of the road of the lake or the river. So it just went dormant for years because nobody really pushed for it. Mm-hmm. And yes, I recognized it early on, and I've acquired a bit of acreage in that area.
So was that while your family was still tied in with Grider Hill that you had your eye on?
No, this I always recognized it, but I didn't acquire any land over there until about 1990. About 30 years ago.
So you began that project 30 years ago, and it took...
Well, I had it in my mind, but it took 10 years of persuading the Corps to ever grant a lease. And I had a lot of opposition. Mr. Figueroa filed a federal lawsuit to stop it. Didn't succeed, but he slowed it down. We had the site in 2012 and didn't get it again until July 5th of 2017 that it was formally announced and lease given on the site to me and Tommy Allen, my partner, and I couldn't have achieved it without Tommy Allen. He's the best partner in the world.
Well, tell us a little bit about Tommy Allen. I haven't heard that name. I think I have read it somewhere, but so how are you and Tommy?
Tommy's father was my closest friend, and he died when Tommy was still in high school. And he worked with the Corps at the time, but he had previously worked in the newspaper, the local newspaper. But he died in his 40s. And but anyway, Tommy helped me and seemed to like the business, and I certainly liked him. And when I got Sunset Dock in 1993, he became my partner, and it was the best move I ever made. I don't know whether it was for him or not, because I remember he was a captain in the Army Reserves, and commandant of a unit in Kentucky, and he gave that up. I told him he couldn't be going to all these summer camps because that's the only time, that's when we make our living. Anyway, years later, with all the stuff going on in Iraq, Tommy said that some officers he had under him, some of them was colonels. Always made me felt bad because I know nobody could be. Tommy had made general. But the silver lining is that I can reconcile myself to, maybe I might have saved his life. He might have got killed over there, so I don't have any regrets.
Good. That's interesting.
You ever been to Sunset?
Yes, on Dale Hall.
Yeah.
That's one of real nice. I mean, you walk in, I feel like I'm at Walmart or a great big store. It's very impressive.
Yeah.
You sure made Rowena a beautiful place too. So, was when somebody like myself walks in Marina at Rowena, is it true that probably every design was, obviously you were the lead on it, but did you have any interior decorator people help or any professionals on, or was it pretty much all your plan?
Well, pretty much my plan and Tommy's. Tommy and I both recognize that people love to sit outside regardless of the temperature. Which at Sunset we didn't do. The